Welcome to the LBF Church Podcast, where we talk about topics that help us grow in our affection towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow him in the ways that he's leading us. I'm Dan Franklin, and if you're part of LBF Church, right now we are going through a series in Genesis, and I wanted to highlight something that we talked about just a few weeks ago as I'm recording this. Pastor Troy talked about Genesis 4 and the story of Cain and Abel. And as I went through Genesis this time, just in the study and preparation, I found myself really transfixed on this story in a new way. And so I wanted to supplement what Troy taught. And for those of you that haven't listened to it, it'll just be a standalone. But to talk about the nature of the story of Cain and Abel and how significant it is, because it can be easy for us to really focus in, all right, Adam and Eve and the creation, and then we just sort of move on to the flood, and there's this little interlude here with Cain and Abel. But it's really not. This is a profound, deep story. In fact, I think I've recommended it before, but John Steinbeck wrote an entire book that's really about this story. The book is called East of Eden. It's profound and amazing. If you're a reader, you should definitely read it. But he really looked at the Cain and Abel story as the story of humanity. I'm not going to say that he's right on that, but he has some really profound insights into what this story tells us. And the story really isn't about Cain and Abel. The story is really about Cain. Abel never talks. Abel is just sort of a character, and the story revolves around Cain's actions and Cain's attitudes. And there's a lot that we can learn from this story because this is a foundational story, not just telling us about one man's battle with temptation or one man's bad decisions, but about how God wants us to wrestle through the internal temptations that we have and what our choices are when we're faced with those temptations. So I'll read through a couple parts of the story. I'm not going to try to focus on the whole thing, but just a couple of the parts of it that really stand out. So you have the introduction to Cain and Abel, that they're the two children of Adam and Eve. And it says, now Abel, Genesis 4, verse 2, now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain came and brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Now, as often happens in these stories in the Bible, we're not given all the information. There's a lot of questions that come up that we want to know about. We want to say, all right, well, first of all, how did they know that their offerings were accepted or not accepted? What happened here? And I'm not going to pretend that I know what happened, but I like to imagine that the way that God would show that he accepted the sacrifice is that he would send fire to consume it. Maybe just because of the Elijah story in 1 Kings chapter 18, where he sends the fire. So just go with me, imaginary for a second. Either way, clearly they knew whether their offering was accepted or not, because Cain was upset that his wasn't. So that they're in the room together and they each bring their offering, and Abel's flame goes up and he's happy because the Lord has accepted his offering, and Cain just waits and nothing. His offering is not accepted. And we're not even told overtly why it wasn't accepted. There's different takes on this, where some people think, well, it wasn't accepted because Abel brought a blood sacrifice, whereas Cain brought a grain sacrifice. And I'll say that's probably not it. That's probably not the problem, because when you look into the future of Israel and all the different offerings that they brought blood offerings. They also brought grain offerings. That doesn't seem like that's a big distinction. And also, Abel was a shepherd, so it was natural for him to bring an animal, whereas Cain was a farmer. It was natural for him to bring some of his crops. Other people zero in on the idea that it specifically says that Abel brought part of the first fruit, whereas with Cain, it just says that he brought some of the stuff. The firstborn versus Cain bringing some of this stuff. And I think that seems more on target. That seems likely that's probably what's part of what's going on. And other people just say, you know what, it's none of that stuff. It's just that Abel's heart was good and Cain's heart was bad. It might even be a combination between the last two, but I think at least that last part is probably right. And we'll see as we move through the story why that's probably right. But probably this is an indication that Abel was living in a way that was upright, and therefore his offering, which was fine, was accepted. And Cain's offering itself may have just been fine. It may have been a totally good offering to offer, but because of the way that he was conducting his life, God wasn't going to accept his offering, his act of worship, because the rest of his life didn't line up with it. But we're told in the aftermath of this, Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. This is a dejected guy. He is unhappy about the fact that his offering hasn't been accepted. And for me, one of the profound things about the story is it is not difficult for me at all to relate to Cain. This guy is a murderer, as you find out in this story. He is a very dark person. And at the same time, I just find his journey and his story arc here to be very familiar. And I think that we're all meant to find this very familiar, because Cain has experienced sort of unwanted negative feedback. He's received an unexpected bad response to his actions. And so he's dejected about it. I think, well, we've all been there before. We've all been in a place, and especially if there's some sense of somebody else telling us something critical about ourselves, where we respond to it with dejection. We've got bad news. We've been criticized. We've been left behind. We got overlooked for a promotion. We didn't get to be a starter on our school team, and that feels very frustrating. Or somebody comes to us and tells us that we did something wrong, and we get written up at work, and we're dejected over that. We're frustrated over it. And it's that much worse when we end up in a position where we're in comparison, where we're comparing ourselves to others, and we end up dealing with envy, because that definitely is a part of this story. So just think about this. And again, we're speculating a little bit, but I think this is fair. Imagine Cain and Abel had gone in together, had both brought their offerings, and both waited for God to accept them, but nothing for Abel, nothing for Cain. No response. God doesn't accept either of their offerings. Now just ask yourself this. Do you think Cain would have been nearly as dejected if that's what had happened? And it just seems highly unlikely that that would have been the response. He and Abel might have even commiserated and talked to each other and said, what do you think this is about? And tried to figure it out and helped each other discern things. But it appears that it was that much more devastating towards Cain, because he's looking at his brother, and his brother apparently in God's sight is good enough and did things that were good enough, but Cain didn't do things that were good enough. So he's downcast and he's dejected, and he's dealing not only with the frustration of having criticism of himself, but at looking at somebody else and basically being told this other person is better than you. Not intrinsically better than you, but their behavior, their offering has brought them greater results, and you don't get those great results because of your behavior and because of your offering. Now, for me, one of the questions that comes up with this is, all right, Cain's dejected. He's angry about this. He has a very natural response. I think many of us can relate to that, where you're upset. If you get criticism, if you get told that you didn't do something well, you get frustrated with that. The question is, what could he have done with that frustration? What could he have done with this bad news that he got about himself? He didn't automatically have to cave into jealousy and rage and kill Abel. There were other things that he could have done about this. This could have been a time for fruitful reevaluation of his life. Cain could have looked at this and said, you know what? I thought I was doing fine, but God just told me that I wasn't. God just told me that my offering wasn't accepted, and maybe that ends up meaning that my life as I'm living it is not as upright as I think it is. This is a time for me to reflect back, think about the way that I'm living, and figure out what I need to do in response to this bad news that I've got about myself. This is a very difficult thing for us to do. To have that time of self-reflection, to say, all right, I've got negativity. I don't think that God was hostile, but let's even step it up and say you received some hostility. You received somebody coming at you with negativity, and you're a little bit surprised by it. Maybe Cain is surprised by it. When this happens, we can automatically jump towards just the unfairness of the world and the fact that if I'm hurt, that must mean I was wrong, and that I was wronged, and that must mean that there's something wrong or unjust about the world. Or we can skip ahead and we can say, all right, did I do anything to bring this on myself? Is my uncomfortable situation of not having my offering accepted a result of my faults and my own behavior? Now, Cain obviously doesn't do this. Cain appears to settle, by the way that he proceeds later, he appears to settle for this view of the world and this view of God that God is unjust, or God is unpleasable, or there's just nothing he could do, or Cain is frustrated over his own inferiority. He ends up striking back against Abel, which if you look at it, you could say, well, this is a weird thing. What does this accomplish that he ends up going after Abel and killing him? How does that improve his situation? And at the same time, I'd say, well, it seems pretty obvious how it improves his situation. If you got two people and you are told this other person is better than you, then your situation, your status improves if you get rid of that person. If they're out of the way, then that better option does not exist. Now, the story I'm about to tell obviously didn't lead to murder. Or I should say, obviously didn't lead to murder, thankfully. But I remember when I was in high school, I played water polo, and as I was going into my junior year, I was going to be on varsity, moved from junior varsity to varsity, and I was really excited about trying to figure out my place on the team. I'd worked really hard. I tried to improve myself, and I thought I'd kind of figured it out. I thought I could look at the team and say, all right, I see where I fit in. I see where I'm going to get playing time and where my spot is going to be. And then another kid who was also going to be a high school junior transferred over, and I remember there being buzz over the different water polo players saying, this guy is good. Now, I did not want him around. His presence was a threat to me. His presence was a threat to my playing time, and I didn't like the idea that he was here. For me, there would have been a positive thing that would have happened through subtraction in my mind. I'm like, well, I don't want him around because if I am told he's better than you, therefore he's going to get your playing time, that is a threat to me. Cain looks at the situation, and his solution to the fact that he has experienced a message that tells him he's in some way inferior or some way not up to snuff, his then desire, his then conclusion is that he can solve that by taking out Abel, by going and committing murder, getting the better person out of the way so that you end up being better just by the subtraction of somebody who's superior to you. The much harder thing to do than just eliminate our competition or wish them away is to take that hard look at ourselves. And here's what I want to add in with this. This story and a lot of scripture points us towards this reality. We as believers in Jesus Christ, and just as human beings in general, we should be very suspicious when we come up with self-serving explanations for why things have gone badly for us. And Cain appears to have come up with one of those, where he said things went badly. Nobody would argue with that. Things went badly for him. And his conclusion was, well, it's just my stupid brother. It's just the injustice of the situation. It's just that he's come and infringed on my space. I got to get him out of there. Cain appears to be this person that just sort of looks at the world, and the world is out to get him, and God is out to get him, and his brother is out to get him, and he has to strike back against all of that in order to fix his situation. He comes up with a very self-serving explanation for why he's experiencing negativity. And I want to say to anybody who's listening, be very suspicious when you come up with a self-serving explanation for why you are receiving difficulties or negativity from other people, because it's the easiest thing that we can do. I'll give you a quick example. This is something that I've seen a little bit in the political world, but it happens all the time, so this is the example that I'll give. One of the controversies over about the last 2 to 3 years has been about NFL players kneeling for the national anthem instead of standing for the national anthem. It's become this national thing that everybody has an opinion on. What I've noticed is that with people on both sides of this, there are people that really, really support the players and say it's good that they're kneeling, it's good that they're protesting, this is a very positive and brave thing to do and a noble thing to do. And there's other people that think that it's not a good thing to do at all, that it divides our country. Now, for the person who's supportive of this, for the person that says it's good that these NFL players are doing this, when you look at the other side and say, all right, there's people who disagree with me, there's people who think that this is a bad thing, and there's people maybe that are giving me some negativity because I am supportive of this, or giving the players some negativity because of what they're doing. Here's the very easy self-serving explanation that you can come up with. The very self-serving explanation is, well, those people are just racists. Clearly, I'm the virtuous person who cares about justice. I'm the virtuous person who thinks that black people should get equal treatment under the law. But these people, these opponents, the people on the other side of this that criticize me or criticize them, they must just be racist. Now, I'll even pause and say, it's not impossible that that is the explanation. But you should at least pause and recognize that is a very self-serving conclusion. That's a conclusion that basically says, I am virtuous, and anybody who disagrees with me is very, very unvirtuous. And it can go exactly on the other side as well. If you're looking at this and you're saying, well, gosh, these guys kneeling for the national anthem, they're just not grateful for our country, they don't really care about our military, they're not very patriotic, I'm very patriotic, and anybody who disagrees with me is just an ingrate who doesn't appreciate our country. once again, just realize that is a very self-serving explanation. You've said, I'm noble, I'm virtuous, I'm a grateful person. I guess anybody who sees the world differently than I do, or anybody that criticizes me for that stance that I've taken, must be somebody who's very unvirtuous. Beware of self-serving explanations. With the national anthem issue, the best thing that people on both sides could do would be to have honest conversations where they're willing to learn the perspective of someone else and come to the conclusion it's possible for there to be legitimate criticisms. It's possible for there to be legitimate criticisms of Colin Kaepernick and of the different people kneeling for the national anthem and the people who are supporting them. And there's also criticisms, legitimate criticisms of those who simply dismiss that as unpatriotic. There are legitimate opinions on both sides of this. And you miss out on that when you go for the self-serving explanation that I'm a virtuous person and my opponents aren't. The reason I keep getting fired from my jobs is because I'm willing to speak truth to power, but my bosses just can't take it. Yeah, or maybe you're being rude and you're overstepping and you're insubordinate. There's that possibility also. And the reason why my wife is always mad at me is because I'm willing to hold the line and make the difficult decisions, and she just doesn't like that. Or maybe you're being really insensitive and you're not listening to her. Maybe there's something wrong with you that's leading towards your situation. We have these convenient explanations all the time for why it's not our fault and why it's other people's fault and why we're good and they're bad. That's what Cain is camping on, and that's why God's little powwow that he has with Cain is so profound to me. This is the most profound part of the entire passage. It's in verses 6 and 7. It says, "Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it.'" And just, if not to say anything else, I think it says something profound about God, that God sees Cain and he knows that in Cain the wheels are turning. He's angry, he's frustrated, he's dejected, he's starting to think about doing something really, really stupid and really, really immoral, and God comes to him about it. God has a powwow. God has this father-son talk. I have times that I take one of my sons and we just go into the bedroom and sit down and really have a heart-to-heart, and I try to give them good fatherly counsel. This is what God is doing with Cain. God is saying, I see what's happening here. I see where this is going to lead. I want to give you some advice. And advice from God is the greatest advice that you could get. And listen to what God says to him. He says, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" Now, this is part of the reason why I think, it seems likely that the reason why Cain's offering wasn't accepted was because he wasn't doing right. Either he wasn't doing right because he didn't bring the first fruits of his crops, or he wasn't doing right because in general in his life he wasn't doing right. In other words, what God is saying to him is, it is within your power to be acceptable. There's not some deep conspiracy against you. You're not being deeply wronged. You're not the victim of some horribly unjust system. It's not that your brother is getting favored or getting a treatment of favoritism. None of that is happening. It is within your power to do whatever it would take to get you accepted. You should be evaluating yourself instead of ready to strike back against the world or against your brother because you feel inferior right now. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? And then he gives them the warning. He says, "But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." And this is where it even gets into the issue of temptation in general, when we're tempted to strike back in revenge in some way. And sometimes that is physical, but in our culture, most of the time it's not physical. It's either through words or words online, or through talking to others and sort of striking back by trying to turn other people against this person that we think has wronged us. There are ways that we look to strike back in revenge. Those are times that sin is crouching at the door. Sin is ready to get us, wants to have us, wants to rule over us. It happens with lust all the time when we have sin crouching at the door, just tempting us. Just go ahead and go for it. It happens with dishonesty. It happens with greed. It happens with all kinds of different areas. Sin wants to have us. And God is looking at Cain. He's saying, you are in a perilous situation right now. You right now are under threat of being ruled by sin. But the powerful thing that he says to him is he says, but you must rule over it. And the idea here is that Cain has a legitimate choice. Cain, once again, is not simply a victim. So Cain, you're really angry. And you could look at that and say, well, I was angry. What could I have done? I was angry. I had to yell at him. I was angry. I had to hit him. I was angry. I had to say that. I was provoked. I had to do it. God says sin is crouching at the door, but you must rule over it. You have within you, and this is Cain, just as a human being created in the image of God, you have within you the ability to make a choice about how you handle this situation. To me, this is just beautiful fatherly counsel from God saying to Cain, all right, you've got this bad situation. You found yourself in an unfortunate situation. You didn't want to be here. You're upset because your sacrifice wasn't accepted. Nobody would like it if their sacrifice wasn't accepted. That's a bad situation you found yourself in. Now, here's what you can do. You can give into your anger. You can give into your paranoia. You can give into your envy, and you can strike against the world and try to fix things through that. Or you can take the time to look at yourself, recognize your own faults, and take actions so that your life is different. And that's where God ends up leading him. Now, of course, sadly, Cain doesn't listen. Cain ends up asking his brother to go out to the field with him, and he kills him. Cain allows sin to have its way. And sadly, I know for many of us, one of the reasons why Cain's story is familiar is not necessarily because we've committed a murder, but because we look at our lives and say, wow, a lot of times I've just gone ahead and given in to those baser desires. I've just said, well, what am I going to do? I'm cornered. I'm in a situation. This is not fair. This is not right. I'm going to try to figure out a way to fix it myself. And we fail in all of that. And it's worth here just even noting that this isn't just a story that gives us this great advice about how we handle the situations, even though I believe that it is. It's also a story that reminds us that as a human race, we all have made the wrong decision. Not every single time, but we all have made the wrong decision many, many times. And we find ourselves, like Cain, under curse and under the condemnation of God. The reason we need a Savior, the reason a Savior was sent to us in Jesus, wasn't because we were really trying to do the right thing, but we just needed somebody to show us. It was because we all, like Cain, had taken the easy way, and we needed a covering for our sins. We needed somebody to come and rescue us from the death and the curse that we had brought on ourselves. But it's also an opportunity for us to back up and look at our situations and say, you know what? When I'm tempted, especially when I'm angry, especially when I've dealt with criticism and I'm ready to rage against the world or rage against the person that's brought this bad news or sort of a negative review about myself, it's an opportunity for me, instead of raging against the world, to look at myself and to believe that there are ways that I can follow Jesus. There are ways that I can improve myself. There are ways that I can do the hard introspection to figure out how I can grow and how I can do things differently so that I don't end up in this situation next time, because God has not set up an unjust world. Even the injustice that we face here in society will one day be rectified. God is not unjust, and God has not put us in a situation where we will ultimately suffer injustice. Following him and trusting him and doing the difficult introspection is going to bring much greater results than us raging against a world that's mistreated us or that we perceive has mistreated us in some way. Well, like I said, there's so much to say about this story. This was just a fragment of the story. There's a lot more after it. But I wanted to zero in on this because I found it profoundly helpful. And I think it really does speak to us when we're in those situations of the heat of temptation, and especially when we're dealing with how do I respond to negativity that I've received about myself and about my own behavior. I hope you found it helpful. If you have a comment or if you have a question, or even if you have a sort of a criticism, I'll try to take it well, of what I've said here, and you think that there's something else going on, I'd love to hear about that. You can comment on this and on any of the podcast episodes that we do just by going to lbf.church and clicking on the little tab that says blog and podcast. If you comment on there, I'll do my best to make sure I respond to that and we can have a dialogue about it. You can also download all the episodes of the LBF Church podcast by just going to iTunes and searching for LBF Church podcast. But apart from that, for me, tomorrow is Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving in retrospect to all of you. And thanks so much for taking the time to listen. This is the LBF Church Podcast.